Welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service Al Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasolidi, president of Al Monitor, and our guest today is Hebah Fisher, CEO and co-founder of Kerning Cultures, the award-winning Middle East podcast network. Before we bring in Hebah, let me mention something my colleagues and I at Al Monitor are watching closely, and which we have talked about previously on this podcast. Last week, during his confirmation hearing, Antony Blinken, U.S. President Joe Biden's nominee to be Secretary of State, warned that talks between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam could, and I'm using Blinken's words, boil over. Blinken promised that U.S. diplomacy in the region would be fully engaged to deal with the issues there. He's right, it could boil over. And to be fair, the Biden administration is not inheriting a cold start on Nile River and Horn of Africa diplomacy. U.S. President Donald Trump agreed to help broker a deal among the three parties in September 2019 at the request of Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. U.S. Treasury Secretary at the time, Steve Mnuchin, actually worked out an agreement with Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, and the World Bank. And by February 2020, they had a framework for dealing with the dam. But when it came time to sign, Ethiopia never showed up. Since then, mediation efforts by the African Union and South Africa have mostly sputtered. The stakes in the Nile Dam talks couldn't be higher for Egypt. Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry told me in an interview with Al Monitor in September 2019, and I'm quoting him here, "For Egypt, the matter of the Nile is a matter of life and death." And he added, I'm quoting again, "I don't think anybody could agree or would agree that Ethiopian development should come at the expense of the lives of Egyptians." Egypt is 90% desert, and the Nile is the only source of water. 95% of Egypt's estimated 100 million citizens live along the river or near it. The Nile's water barely meets Egypt's needs. They could use more, and therefore any reduction could be a massive hardship for Egyptians. Now, Egypt's position is that Ethiopia should fill the dam over maybe 10 years or some period of time to assure equitable distribution and to manage any technical issues that might come up regarding water management. Ethiopia, in return, says Egypt is overstating the impact of the dam or problems that could result from seasonal or climate variations. For Ethiopia, the dam is a matter of sovereignty and national pride. Now, Sudan, the third party, is tilted toward Egypt in the talks. Khartoum also stands to gain from the dam, which could help curtail episodic flooding and, over time, provide cheaper and more accessible energy. This all became more complicated and intertwined because of the Ethiopian civil war and its impact on Sudan. While the Nile talks have been, until now, mostly a high-stakes Egypt-Ethiopia diplomatic dispute, with Sudan in a supporting role for Egypt, the Sudan-Ethiopia fault line now risks military escalation. And with all this going on, it's hard to believe only 2 years ago in 2019, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed won the Nobel Peace Prize for ending the 20-year border dispute with Eritrea. But today, the fault lines are ominous. There are the border disputes we're talking about here between Sudan and Ethiopia over the Al-Fasher region, and between Ethiopia and Eritrea and Tigray, where the civil unrest has started. Thousands of more refugees leaving Ethiopia for Sudan, which already houses over 1 million refugees. Fragile economies in Sudan and Ethiopia, and the consequences for Somalia and the Horn of Africa of what could be endemic ethnic conflict. The Biden administration, in my opinion, has a strong diplomatic hand here. The U.S. has close ties with all three parties to the Nile talks. If managed right, there's plenty of Nile water to share, and no one is talking about infringing on Ethiopia's ultimate sovereignty over the dam. Egypt, to its credit, has until now so far played the Nile talks by the diplomatic book, and U.S. partners in the region, including the United Arab Emirates, can play a helpful mediating role. We go into more detail in this week's Week in Review column. I'd encourage you to look at that and to read Al Monitor's coverage. We cover this issue daily. And look out for coming guests on this podcast to discuss what's happening in the Nile Dam talks. Now, I am very pleased to welcome our guest today, Hebah Fisher, co-founder and CEO of Kerning Cultures Network, which is setting the trend for immersive podcasts in the region. Hebah is a world-class entrepreneur and media executive and producer, totally tuned in to the identity and cultural trends that are influencing how Arab young people are consuming media. My conversation with Hebah Fisher begins now. Hebah, welcome to On the Middle East.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
I want to hear a little about your personal journey that took you to Kerning Cultures Network. Maybe we can start here. You're an Egyptian American, someone who travels and lives literally and figuratively and in between the US and the West and the Arab world. What experiences led you on a road to founding an award-winning media podcast devoted to immersive Arabic and English stories?
Sure. So we started Kerning Cultures coming up on 6 years ago now. And it was very much born out of a bit of a frustration, really, that most mainstream media in the Middle East doesn't speak to us youth. It's really created for our parents' generation, which is really alienating. And we're a very young population across the Arab world. It's about 140 million of us between the ages of 15 and 35. And so we started Kerning Cultures. It was a smaller vision of just a single show at the time that's now grown into a network. But in the beginning, it was just we wanted to create media and tell stories that we were actually interested in, the kinds of stories that we'd want to turn and have a conversation about with a friend. And we weren't getting that from certainly the radio and other forms of media around us. So we decided to start something of our own.
And tell me, what was it about traditional media that you and your demographic wasn't getting? What were you looking for that wasn't there?
Most mainstream media across the Middle East is one of a couple of things. Either it's very politicized and there's some kind of an agenda, or it's really superficial. And I really think it's just a waste of time, unfortunately. And then thirdly, there's a lot of, we import a lot of stuff when we're talking about film and TV. We import Turkish shows, for example, import Spanish shows, and then dub it over. And so there's a lack of original content in general across multimedia. And in podcasting is a very new medium to the Arab world. I mean, when we launched Kerning Cultures, we were one of the first podcasts coming out of the entire region. It's grown a lot. So there's probably close to 2,500 shows coming out of the Middle East right now, either in Arabic or in English. But when we started, there was like maybe 10. So it's still picking up. We're still very much in the early stages. But podcasting was this total open space where there wasn't really any content in general, and so we were sort of setting a standard with the kind of storytelling that we produced.
Tell me about you as an Egyptian American who lives between the U.S. and the Arab world. Did that influence your thinking about media and the type of shows you wanted to do?
I didn't actually have a background in media before Kerning Culture, so it was very much a very steep learning curve. And I mean, our team is incredible, and every producer on the Kerning Cultures team did have a background in media, and so I learned a lot from everybody. But for me, I think the part of being half and half was just, my mother's Egyptian, my father's American, and you find that storytelling is a way to kind of communicate very easily between both cultures. And so that's just something that I grew up with. Both of my parents are incredible storytellers. So many people in my family are really great storytellers. So it's just, I think that's kind of been, in my blood and what I'm familiar with. But translating that to podcasts was a totally new game. And it took us, I think, 3.5 years to get good at producing a story within podcasting. And now, our stuff tops the charts regularly across the region, and we've won awards, and our stuff airs on Radiolab and Gimlet Media and NPR. I mean, it's definitely internationally best in class, but it took us several years to get here for sure.
Tell me about how you put a lot of work, and it shows, into the production of your podcast and how they sound. Really impressive and immersive, to use your words.
Thanks, Andrew.
Tell us about how that using sound on the one hand and video and images on the other. Do you anticipate at some point your podcast going more visual? You have some visuals, and we'll talk about some of them in a minute. But tell me a little about your thoughts behind the production of the shows.
So there's something incredibly powerful with just audio, and I'm a very big believer. Our team is a really big believer, and that's why we started with podcasts, and we'll continue to be an audio first company for sure. I think the extent of which there'll be a visual component is in the context of promotion, and so we do a lot of our promotion on social media, which are all visual first platforms, right? If you think of Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, I mean, you need to have, it's boring if it's just a link. And so that's the extent of which we incorporate visuals into our production, more as a way to promote the episode. But the audio episode is always that is it. That is the thing. And if you think about how visceral listening to a podcast can be, I mean, that's the experience that we strive for in every production that we do, where you're just completely swept away and up into these story worlds, and hearing. I think the other detail of podcasts that I love so much is people are telling their own stories in their own voice, right? It's not like a book where somebody is paraphrasing. It's very, very much, they are telling their own stories in their own voice. And so there's something very, very evocative in that. There's something very relatable. It's a really powerful space to build empathy, I think, where you can really imagine yourself in the person's shoes, and you kind of fill in all the details of the stories that they're sharing. And I feel like I watch movies, I love TV. Like I'm not hating on video as a medium, but I do think that my imagination is fired a lot more powerfully when I'm hearing somebody's story rather than when I'm watching somebody's story. Like it's a lot more passive when I'm just watching, like I'm not doing that much work. I'm just kind of on the receiving end of something. Whereas when I'm listening to somebody's story, I fill in a lot of the details with my own imagination. And I think you become almost like an active participant in the story in some way, which is just so cool. It's just that as an experience is awesome. And that's why we're obsessed with podcasts.
I think it's a fascinating thing you point out. I've always believed in that power of sound and in the immersive quality of it, whether you're listening to music or even growing up as a sports fan. People used to say, well, I like to listen to a baseball game, for example. Yeah. And it's almost like, and you're like, well, why would you want to listen to it as opposed to watching it? You're like, well, if you're on a long drive or you catch these stories, and it's really powerful. And I used to say it to myself, I kind of ask people, are you the type of person, if you walk into a room or you come home, do you turn on the radio, music, or satellite as it is now, or do you turn on the TV? And to me, it's always just the default has been put on music, put on something that brings sound, and it can either be there in the background, or it can be something like you say, you can just find yourself sitting down and listening and having the type of experience that would be more active than I think a lot of people realize until they think about it.
I completely agree.
Hebah, what are some of the trends you have been picking up in identity and culture that have influenced your podcast content?
What we do is we create immersive podcasts for the curious listener, and we're just all about really good storytelling. I think in terms of the identity piece, it kind of ties into what we were speaking about earlier, and the fact that most mainstream media in the region isn't created for its youth, and so from an identity perspective, that becomes really hard to relate to that kind of content. And so podcasts are this space where it's us creating content for ourselves, and so it's very relatable. And we have, on a regular basis, listeners will send in essays, honestly, essays of how much listening to our stories mean to them, and how it's the first time that they heard somebody speak about something like this, or they really see themselves in these stories. And I'm thinking particularly around some of the stuff we've done around mental health, for example. Like these are topics that are not spoken out loud at all, and that's a very isolating experience as a result. And so to be able to hear people share their stories struggling with postpartum depression, or what it was like growing up as a child where you didn't have a lot of your family wasn't particularly affectionate, or whatever it might be, just to hear somebody tell their story with that experience, and whether you relate or not, but just for it to be actually vocalized, I think is incredibly powerful. And so that's something that a lot of our audiences really resonates. And the other thing that I think that's very core to what Kerning Cultures does as a network, and in contrast really to a lot of other podcast networks that are coming out of the region, is we're very transnational. Like, we're very much a regional network. So our producers are in Egypt, they're in Lebanon, they're in Saudi, they're in the UAE. We have some stragglers in the UK and the US, and we work with freelancers across the region. And our vision is to work with freelancers in every city across the Arab world. And so what that means is that whenever you listen to a Kerning Culture show, either in Arabic or in English, you're going to hear stories from a lot of different places. And, we say we're all Arab, we say we're all Arab at the end of the day, but honestly, we don't know each other that well. And so this being able to hear a story from Sudan, or a story from Palestine, or a story from Lebanon it's really beautiful. You feel this connection, and it's just, I think that's another distinction of the kind of storytelling that we do, is that you really, it's this cross-cultural kind of platform, and it's all apart from Sattar's Eclipse, which is our first fiction show that we just went live with last month. Everything is nonfiction, so it's all based on real life stories and interviews with real people, which is just really powerful.
When you do a show like on mental health issues, which, even here in the United States, it still can be a touchy subject. There's a lot of learning that's gone on in the aggregate about the challenges people face. But what type of reactions do you get in the region when you talk about what's been a sensitive subject like that?
It's really well received. It's very, very well received. And so these are the shows that regularly top the charts across every country library. You know how Apple does their charts. And so across not even just mental health and fitness categories, but just across all podcasts, this is regularly like number one within the top 10 across different countries. It's very, very well received. And it's necessary. I think this is really important conversations for us to be having. And the other layer that we add on top of this, which has been obviously paused because of COVID, is we host what we call listening parties in different cities where we have producers around the world. And so we'll gather our community in coffee shops and art galleries, and we'll play an episode of a podcast and then have a discussion about it afterwards. And those are hands down some of my favorite evenings. And it's kind of like being a part of a book club without having to read the book. and to start in a room full of strangers, and then, you're having a conversation about, say, postpartum depression. It's just so beautiful. It's really, really beautiful and it takes what's typically a very solitary listening experience. If you think about our normal behavior when we're listening to podcasts, we're typically alone. And then now you're in a community, and there's this instant sense of a community around you as you're really discussing and offering advice and sharing your own personal experiences on top of the story you just heard. it's that's another dimension to the kind of storytelling that we do that I think is just fantastic, and people walk away, new friendships out of this, and it's a nice way to interact with the material, especially when we're talking about really difficult subjects like mental health.
When you're dealing with the subject matter and looking at the trends of young people in the region, is there still an interest with the political issues like the wars in Syria, Yemen, and Libya, and these things, or the Israeli-Palestinian issue? Does that still come up, or do people look to mainstream media for that and come to the podcast for something else?
So deliberately as a network, we stay away from politics as often as we can, frankly. And that's largely because, the reason we started Kerning Cultures in the first place was because we wanted to tell other kinds of stories, right? There's so much media, so much political media that there's plenty of other places to go for those kinds of conversations. What I'll say, though, is of course, politics influences every aspect of our lives in general. And so it inevitably comes through in some of the storytelling, but we approach it from a very human first perspective. So, for example, one of our Arabic shows called Bihub, which is, it's about love and relationship stories, loosely defined. So, for example, a mother's relationship with her son, for example, in addition to like a couple's relation. There's an episode that we did called Shayef al-Bahr, which translates to Do You See the Sea? And it's about Palestinians' relationship with the sea. But inside Palestine, especially in the West Bank, your movements are restricted, right? And you have to go through checkpoints and you have to get permits. And so even though you are 20 kilometers as a Palestinian away from the sea, it's really, really hard to actually get to the sea. And some Palestinians spend 30 years before they're able to actually touch the water, which is insane to think about. And so that was the way that we told that story, more so about the relationship with the sea. And of course, the overarching narrative is about living under occupation. But it's not focused on that from a political perspective, if that makes sense. It's a lot more focused on what is the lived experience within that.
Do you find that these podcasts are in the demographic that you're targeting, are they replacing radio and digital print media or complementing them? How do you see it?
I think for the most part, they're complementing them for sure. I will say I don't know anybody my age who listens to the radio in the Arab world.
Really?
Yeah, unless it's like by accident or like your Bluetooth, your phone died or something. Like why you can choose what you want to listen to whenever you want to listen to it now when you're talking about streaming music or you're talking about podcasts.
Right.
And it's very much an older generation that listens to the radio. But I think podcasts, of course, are very complementary to any other sort of digital media. And podcasts have a certain place, I think. So it's not like I read the news and I read magazines and I read books and I watch Netflix. Like all of that still exists. But I listen to podcasts when I'm doing really boring tasks, right? Like when I'm folding laundry, it transforms this mundane experience into something I look forward to. Or when I'm going for a run, which I'm never encouraged to do, except, I can actually catch up on my next episode. So it reaches me, I think, when other media doesn't, and it's an additive. It's not a substitute, at least at this stage in my life, and I think that's true for most of our audience as well.
How does it compare from what you know of U.S. media trends among younger people? Does it pretty much track the same in terms of media consumption and podcasts?
Yeah, so the U.S. as a market, there's about 150 million podcast listeners in the U.S. that are listening to an average of 5 to 7 hours of podcasts a week, and it tends to a younger audience, so between, I would say, 18 and 45. And it also, the typical podcast listener demographic is a young, as we said, an educated and affluent listener. And that tracks globally, in fact, right now. So podcasting is not mass media yet in a lot of markets. It tends to kind of cater to that demographic. And it's the same thing in the Middle East right now. So a young, educated, affluent demographic that's listening. Podcasts are growing like crazy in the Arab world. So as I mentioned, when we launched KC about 6 years ago, there were very few podcasts and very few podcast listeners as a result. But in the past couple of years, it's grown like crazy. And what's been reported is that there's at least 10 million podcast listeners currently in the Arab world. I think the number is much higher, but there's only been 2 reports that have done on 2 countries. And it's growing like crazy. So it's the same customer profile as a Netflix subscriber. So again, tracking in terms of education and affluence level, digital savviness. But I really believe that the Arab world can top global listener penetration for podcasts in the next 5 years, just because of how digitally savvy we are. We have the highest smartphone penetration rates globally. We're very young, as I mentioned, and we're insane consumers of content right now. So the Middle East is one of the growth markets for platforms like Netflix, for example. And if you look at social media, MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, tops global usage for Facebook, Snapchat, and YouTube. And so podcasting is the next frontier of media. And I think we're going to see similar trends happen in the Arab world for podcasts in a few short years.
Let's talk about some of your programs. I really liked Al Empire. There were some great discussions about different roads to success. And in English, for those of us who's at best proficient Arabic is mostly faded. But you're discontinuing that one, but you got other good ones coming in the present. And you mentioned earlier Soccer's Eclipse, which again is in Arabic. I've worked through it a little bit, but it seems to just be really cool and so sophisticated in its production. So tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, so we have 8 shows underneath our network of Kerning Cultures, 6 in Arabic and 2 in English. And the Arabic shows range from, we have a daily guided meditation series. We have short historical stories that we had done for last Ramadan and are going to do something similar this coming Ramadan. Sa'ir's Eclipse is an 8-episode adventure thriller. It's our first fiction series that we've been producing for a year and a half. Actually, it took a really long time to get to that quality of production. It's with a cast of actors, and it profiles an adventure travel influencer on a trip of a lifetime to witness an upcoming solar eclipse in the middle of the empty quarter, the desert in Saudi. And it's a fantastic series. If you are an Arabic speaker, I highly encourage you checking it out. You can search Madalat Saqr on any podcast app. We're as a network, we're eager to experiment with a bunch of different kinds of content, and so we play with different genre, we play with different topics, we're playing with different styles. So short form versus long form. Fiction versus nonfiction, and we were just strategizing as a team for what the next year will look like for us, and I'm super excited.
This season, you've mentioned that you'll be doing shows on the impact of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, and that was a huge and pivotal event in the region for the people of Kuwait, for the people of Iraq too. It set so many things in motion. Tell us a little about how you're approaching that subject.
Yeah, so this is a single episode on the upcoming season for Kerning Cultures, which is our flagship show. So it's the Kerning Cultures Network, and then our first podcast is also called Kerning Cultures. So this is an English language series where we tell stories from across the Middle East and North Africa and the spaces in between. So every episode is a different documentary series or a different documentary story. And this particular episode is looking at the aftermath aftermath of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990, which we all lived through as very little people, and we were profiling some families as they had to flee Kuwait. And I won't ruin the episode. I highly encourage you to listen to. It's a beautiful piece, but it's very much focused on the impact of we profile a couple of families and what it was like for them and where they went after when they left.
And you've got another one coming up on the killing of Mehmet Tawal Pasha by Armenian assassins after the genocide. Tell us a little about the thought behind that program.
Yeah, so this is another episode on that same show, on the Kerning Culture show. So English storytelling, and this was profiling a group of ordinary citizens, Armenians, who decided to take justice into their own hands because it wasn't being served by any legal system, and they weren't they weren't militarily trained at all. So it's really quite fascinating to see how they kind of mapped out this serving of justice, which again, we go into kind of the history of the Armenian case and the Armenian genocide, and then these people. So all of it will make sense if you listen to the episode, which I highly encourage you to do. But it's a profile on this group and how they organized and what their thinking was, and also what's really quite extraordinary is this as a case study became or this as an incident, as a historical moment, actually became a case study for how to define justice thereafter, which is part of the thinking behind any episode that we produce is we're really focusing on a singular experience, but ultimately the vision or the goal is that you kind of scale out by the end of the episode and you can think a bit more universally about, okay, well, how does this one instance apply to me, for example?
Yeah, but the Kerning Cultural Network has been an amazing success story since you started, 2015. You started in Dubai. You now are in 7 cities. You're a venture-funded podcast. Tell us what that means and a little about the business side of your operation.
Yeah, so when our first story went live in 2015, and it took several years, honestly, for us to get good at storytelling, frankly. And we raised a round of investment in 2019, which Kerning Cultures is the first venture-backed podcast company in the Middle East, which I'm really, really proud of. And we've really opened up the industry for other companies who have raised since. And it's all been born with the same passion that we are building a media company that we can be proud of from the Arab world, and one that's producing content that we ourselves can get excited about and our peers can get excited about. And the vision is we really believe in the medium of podcasts and the potential and the opportunity ahead of us. And like I said, I mean, we really believe that the Arab world can top global listener penetration for podcasts in the next couple of years. And so making sure that we're creating the kind of content that can meet that demand. And we've grown a lot as a team. As you said, we're in several cities around the region, and we're building a premier podcast network, inshallah, to serve the Arab world. It's been a pretty crazy ride, and I think we're just getting started.
Hebah, thank you for your time today on the Middle East. Really enjoyed talking to you. Very much a fan of your podcast and looking forward to your upcoming season.
Thank you, Andrew. This has been great. Thank you for the time.
We will be right back after this short break.
I'm Ben Caspit, Al Monitor veteran columnist reporting from Israel, one of the world's major news and action suppliers of all times, comparing to its tiny size. I've been covering and analyzing the political, diplomatic, and military arenas in Israel for over 34 years. My best-selling biography, The Netanyahu Years, was out 2 years ago. I covered 7 prime ministers, 1 major war, 2 intifadas, 1 prime minister's assassination, 2.5 peace treaties, 4 military operations in Gaza, and it's not letting up anytime soon. I'm glad to invite you to On Israel, our brand new podcast, where we will discuss major events in Israel and its surroundings, talk to decision makers, leaders, and analysts, and try to understand the chaos that comes with the territory of Israel and the Middle East. You will never have a dull moment with us. See you soon here on Israel Al Monitor.
Thank you all for listening to On the Middle East. I would like to thank our production team of Phil Calabro of Al Monitor and Beowulf Roshland of Two Square Media Productions. We will be back next week, and in the meantime, please sign up for this and our other Al Monitor podcast on Israel at your favorite podcast platform.